agreement around the table to discuss the motion. So, Mr. Cannings, you're next in line.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. I know some of you cut short your summer plans. I know I should be sitting in a dentist chair right now, so I'm concerned about that. But so I think this is an important subject. I agree with the Conservatives that we need to talk about this, perhaps for completely different reasons, and I would support the motion. We're obviously here today in this special meeting because of the recent Federal Court of Appeal decision to quash the federal government's approval of the Trans Mountain expansion project. And the court quashed the project, or the approvals, based on two errors made. One was in the environmental assessment part, the lack of consideration of the marine transport issues, and also the error was inadequate consultation with First Nations. Now, the Conservatives here are, of course, gleefully blaming the Liberals for this mess, and it's true the Liberals do deserve some of the blame here, but the irony in calling this meeting is that this is a problem that was created by the Conservatives in the previous government. And it's doubly ironic, for instance, to hear Jason Kenney complaining about the incompetence of the Liberals in this file when he was at the cabinet table when this mess was created. And it's the Liberals who ran on a promise to clean up this mess, to redo the approval process for Trans Mountain with a new system, and then they failed to do that, and that's why we're here today. So it's the Conservatives creating this mess, the Liberals failing to clean it up, and I hate to say I told you so, but that's why we're here. In their rush to get pipeline projects done, the Conservatives gutted the Fisheries Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, the environmental assessment process, and on their watch, the NEB hearings into the Trans Mountain expansion were widely criticized for being too narrow in scope, didn't properly consult with First Nations, and the courts also quashed the approval of the Northern Gateway pipeline for much the same reason as they cited here. So it's kind of a pattern. Both the Liberals and the NDP, as I said, ran on that promise to redo the Trans Mountain expansion approval process under a new process with more rigorous science and more community input. The Prime Minister repeatedly said this on the campaign trail, but they broke that promise and instead simply had a ministerial panel tour through the region with very short notice to hear from First Nations and other communities, businesses, and concerned citizens about the project. Nothing was even officially recorded at these meetings. The panelists simply took their own notes and produced a report at the end of the process. And that report posed 6 questions that they felt the Liberal government had to answer before making their decision on the project. And as far as I know, those questions have never been properly answered. Now, one of the 2 critical errors the government made, according to the Federal Court of Appeal, was the failure to properly consult with Indigenous peoples. The consultation process was simply bureaucrats who were sent out to listen to First Nations concerns and relay those concerns to Cabinet. As the court repeatedly states in the decision, they were simply note takers. There was no attempt made to actually address these concerns. In fact, the consultation team and the government apparently mistakenly believed they couldn't add any more conditions on Kinder Morgan than the NEB had done. So why bother consulting if you can't make any change? And that's what the court found was the critical error. And one example of that failure is the concern of the Coldwater First Nation, who wanted the pipeline to take an optional route, the west route, so it avoided crossing their aquifer. That's a big concern, but there's no evidence that actually acting on that concern was ever considered. And I just want to quote a couple of paragraphs from the decision here around the consultation process. It starts, good faith is required on both sides in the consultative process. The common thread on the Crown's part must be the intention of substantially addressing Aboriginal concerns as they are raised through a meaningful process of consultation. And that the controlling question in all situations is what is required to maintain the honour of the Crown and to effect reconciliation between Crown and the Aboriginal peoples with respect to the interests at stake. And those are quotes that the court took from a previous ruling from the Haida Nation case. You know, so this is not news. This is not, the government knew this before they went into the process. And the decision goes on to make two final points on consultation. It says, first, when the Crown knows or ought to know that its conduct may adversely affect the Indigenous right or title of more than one First Nation, and we've heard concerns around that in there. It says each First Nation is entitled to consultation based upon the unique facts and circumstances pertinent to it. So if half the First Nations along the route were adequately consulted, or felt they were adequately consulted, and half felt they weren't, it's just not good enough. You have to consult with every First Nation. And secondly, it's important to understand, this is again a quote from the decision, it's important to understand that the public interest and the duty to consult do not operate in conflict. As a constitutional imperative, the duty to consult gives rise to a special public interest that supersedes other concerns commonly considered by tribunals asked to assess the public interest. In the case of the Board, a project authorization that breaches the constitutionally protected right of Indigenous peoples cannot serve the public interest. And I just earlier this year, I put a question on the order paper about the 6 questions that the ministerial panel posed, and I'll just want to quote one paragraph on the answer I received from the government that pertains to this consultation, and it says, while there are Indigenous communities opposed to the project, there are others in support of it. The goal of free, prior and informed consent is to ensure a holistic approach to interests through transparent processes aimed at building consensus. It is the same goal at the heart of the government's current legislation to modernize Canada's environmental assessments and regulatory reviews. I could go on, but it just, to me, this shows the government doesn't get it. They're talking about building consensus within First Nations. It's each First Nation has the right to proper consultation, and when they talk about bringing in Indigenous rights, for instance, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, into modern Canadian legislation, they failed to do that in Bill C-69, the bill that updates our environmental assessment process. So the government knew the proper way forward, and they've decided to do something quite different. So I'll just finish my comments on consultation by saying that the government knows what proper consultation is. They should. It's not an impossible task. It's been done before. It just requires more effort and that sincere desire to address concerns, to address the concerns, rather than just writing them down. And we've heard here in this committee about some good examples of that. The Squamish process regarding wood fiber LNG, we've heard how the Squamish Nation approached that and how that worked. It took some more effort, but it was done properly, and they got to the end game. And we've heard numerous examples in the mining industry. I think the mining industry has some great examples we can follow on how to properly consult with Indigenous peoples and bring them into the benefits of resource extraction. Now, the other area the Court of Appeal pointed out was the failure to include concerns about marine transportation in the Trans Mountain Expansion Approval Study. One of the main concerns there is the status of the southern resident population of orcas, something we've heard a lot about in the news this summer, various news items on the plight of that population. Now, the Liberals are relying on their ocean protection plan to cover off those concerns, and it's a plan that claims to offer a world-class oil spill response. You know, this summer I was in Spokane, Washington, attended the Pacific Northwest Economic Region meetings that brings together legislators from across, you know, Oregon, Washington, over to Saskatchewan, up to Alaska and the Yukon Northwest Territories. And I talked to American legislators and other people about the Ocean Protection Plan. And one thing they said repeatedly, the ones that were very apprised of the situation, said that, you know, Canada calls this a world-class plan, and it's world-class only in the sense that it kind of meets basic world standards. It's not world-class in the sense of being one of the best. And they pointed out that they have a very highly, you know, a very modern way of tracking shipping down the Pacific coast that Canada does not. They want Canada to be part of this system so that we can act proactively when trouble occurs, and Canada has been stonewalling these attempts. So they feel that they have a real world-class system, and they're concerned about increasing oil tanker traffic off our coasts because they feel we're not putting that extra effort in. So I'll just close here by saying that the actions of this government and the previous Conservative government have not only delayed these projects that they feel are so important to Canada, they have polarized public opinion on pipelines and resource extraction in general. You know, when people who are concerned about the environment or First Nations reconciliation are labeled foreign-funded radicals, it makes a wide public choose sides and makes it very difficult to have a reasonable discourse. And I think there's a way forward to reduce this polarization. I think it's important as a nation that we travel that path, because right now it's very difficult to have a polite discourse on pipelines or a lot of things, climate action in Canada. And, you know, I've been involved in a number of meetings here in Ottawa with a group called Positive Energy out of the University of Ottawa. I'm not sure if anyone else here has gone to those meetings, but their goal is to find ways to bridge that gap, to bring these sides together so that we can have these important conversations. And I was at one of their meetings and happened to be sitting next to Nick Nanos, the pollster. He had done some polling for Positive Energy, and that polling found that only 2% of Canadians had high confidence in our energy regulatory system, in the National Energy Board, essentially. And I won't go into all the details, but he said there was a path forward through his polling. He said the path forward is through more involvement of First Nations and local communities to bring those voices into the national discourse, into the regulatory process. That would give people more confidence there, and so we have to look down that path. And so just say, to finish, the NDP was criticized for our call to redo the Trans Mountain expansion process under a proper system. Critics said it would take too long, an extra year or two. Well, here we are 3 years later, and we're back at square one. So the court decision is a reminder that we have to put the effort in at the start. There are no shortcuts, and we feel it's time for a thorough and critical look at our energy strategy in Canada, time to invest boldly in the clean energy sector, to provide good, long-lasting jobs in a sector that is the true future of the world energy market. And we feel that purchasing old pipelines is not proper use of public funds. Let's invest in the future. Thank you.